is Michael from salesmade.co, and in today's module we are going to be covering how does property investment work in Australia. We're going to go through the process of the real estate transaction in Australia, as well as some of the details of how to set up the right SPVs, or the special purpose vehicles, the structures that you are going to own the properties, and we'll also go through the ways to calculate your return on investment and profit on investment. So let's first of all go through the steps of the actual property investment transaction. So the first stage is pre-contract, and this is when before you even buy, you need to be aware of what the right legal structures that you want to buy the properties under, and what are the risks, what are your returns. Okay, so this is before you purchase. And during the contract stage, you are engaging your attorney or solicitors or lawyers, depending on which country you are. But in Australia, we use the term solicitors or conveyancers, and these guys are there to check the legal agreement on behalf of buyers. So if you recall from our last session, in Australia, the buyers and sellers probably never meet. Okay, so the buyer would have the buyer solicitor, and the seller has the seller solicitor. So in this case, the seller is the developer. The developer's solicitor will prepare the contract of sale for each unit, and if the buyer wants to buy, the buyer needs to engage a solicitor in Australia, or at least accredited in Australia, to check the contracts on behalf of the buyers, negotiate terms, communicate with the seller's solicitor, and make the deal happen. And then we've got pre-settlement. So pre-settlement means before the transfer of title, so before the settlement of the actual transaction, when the title gets transferred from the seller to the buyer. Before that happens, there's a few things that needs to be done. So first of all, as we said previously, the contract needs to be negotiated, checked, verified, signed, and also the fact that if the buyer wants to get a loan from a lender or from a bank in Australia, he or she needs to make the formal application to get the loan, and that could be through a broker or through the bank directly. Either way, there is virtually no additional cost up front in order to apply for that loan. And before the settlement happens, the lender will need to release the fund to the seller, and the lender will generally have the security over the title of the property. Okay, so when the loan gets released, that's when we can trigger the next step, being the settlement. Okay, so settlement is when the fund gets released from the bank or from the lender to the seller. The seller issues, or the seller would engage the council or the state government to issue the certificate, the title, which then gets transferred from the seller to the buyer. Okay, after the buyer pays all the stamp duties and all the taxes. Okay, so formally, then the buyer would own the property. Now, post settlement is after the transaction. So the transaction, in our opinion, in terms of property investment, doesn't stop from when the buyer owns the land or owns the property. When the buyer has bought the property, we will then need to be engaged to either resell the property after a number of years, or most likely rent out the property to tenants and make sure that all the rents are collected on time. The properties are managed, maintained well, and therefore it generates a healthy cash flow for the investors. Okay, so the post-settlement is generally made up of two components, being us being engaged by the tenants, by the buyers to find tenants, to collect rent, and also after a number of years to resell the property for profit. Okay, so that's generally the transaction process. So first of all, let's look at pre-contract. Now, as we said, one very important part of pre-contract is determining what structure or what special purpose vehicle or SPV, or the right structure that as a buyer you want to hold your property under. Okay, so there are three main ways, and we'll look at what each of the ways are, as well as their risks and benefits. So first of all is owning the property under your own name. Okay, and you can do that in Australia whether you're an Australian resident, citizen, or a foreigner. So let's say in this case, a person, John Smith, he can own the property under his name. Okay, so the title of the property belongs to John Smith himself. The good thing about it is it's very simple. Okay, you don't have to set up any special purpose vehicle or any company or trust for that matter. You just write your own name on the contract. Okay, so there is no extra cost in relation to setting up anything to own the property. The bad thing about it is it gives literally no asset protection, and it gives maximum exposure. So what do I mean by that? I'll give you an example, a very extreme example, but it's real. Okay, so let's say in this case, John Smith owns a property under his own name. A thief decides to visit John's house and tries to steal things, obviously. The thief bangs his head on the wall, hurt himself. Now, the thief can sue John. Okay, we kind of sort of touched on this example in the previous module. And if this property is owned under John's own name, the thief sues John, John will need to compensate the thief. Okay, so that has actually happened in court in Australia. And if John doesn't have the cash flow, then the thief could theoretically hire a lawyer to go after John's assets. Okay, so all the assets owned under John's name. And John, in this case, would probably be forced to sell his property in order to compensate the thief. Okay, I know it sounds ridiculous, but that unfortunately is something that can happen. So if John has the home under his name, the property under his name, the car under his name, whatever it is, as long as it's traceable that people can find assets under John's name, then John's assets are exposed. Okay, so there is absolutely no asset protection in this case. John could lose everything. So that's the first example. Now, a slightly better case is, okay, well, John learns his lesson. John decides to create a company, call it XYZ Co. Limited. He creates a company, and he is the director of this company. Obviously, the company, as usual, has its directors and shareholders. John can make himself or his wife, his family as his shareholders, and use the company to own the property. Okay, so in this case, the title of the property belongs to the company or the company's name. Okay, so there is an extra layer of shield, if you like. So when John gets sued later on, and people go after John's personal assets, well, in this case, the property itself does not belong to John. Okay, it belongs to the company. And people can still search that, who owns the company? Well, if John is a shareholder, one of the shareholders, then theoretically people can still go after John. But this, comparing to this, obviously this has a higher level of protection. So the good thing about it is it's still relatively simple. Okay, in order to have a company in Australia, you simply just need to register a company online. Okay, that can be done in less than half an hour. And it's relatively safe for asset protection in comparison to owning the property under John's own name. Okay, now as we said, there is still some exposure if John gets sued and it's discovered that John owns part of the company, then John could theoretically lose shares in the company, which indirectly would also cause him to lose part of the property or all of the property. Okay, so still there is some exposure. And there is also ASIC fees. So ASIC stands for Australia Securities Investment Commission. Australia Securities and Investment Commission. So this is generally, if you're from the USA or countries similar to USA, there is a body called SEC, which generally issues the certificates to companies, charges companies for renewing every year in terms of the company license, so on and so forth. There is ASIC fees associated with setting up the company, and also there is fees associated with renewing the company every year. Okay, so there is some fees in there, but it's well below $1,000, so that's nothing to be worried about, but still there are the fees that you have to be aware. Okay, so this is the second way of owning the property through a company. Now, the third way, in our opinion, probably the safest, is instead of having a company, John sets up a trust. Okay, a trust is not a company. A trust is like a shell. Okay, a shell that no one can actually see inside. except John himself, perhaps his beneficiaries, and perhaps his lawyers. Okay, so what happens is John, in this case, he sets up a trust, called a John Smith Trust or JS Trust, and John is the trustee of the trust, meaning that he is the sole controller of the trust. The trust, unlike shares and the directors, the trust have beneficiaries. Okay, so there are no shareholders and no directors, but there are beneficiaries. Beneficiaries can be John himself, John's family, anybody that John appoints to as a beneficiary. And the reason it's called beneficiary is because those beneficiaries being either people, companies, different entities, those entities would be the ones to receive the benefits or the proceeds or the profit from the trust. Okay, or the cash flow generated from the property owned by the trust. So in this case, John creates the trust, nominate his beneficiaries, himself, his wife, his kids. As long as you're 18 years old or older, you can be a beneficiary. And then use the trust to own the property. So in this case, the property title is owned under the trust name. And as we said, the trust is like a shell. Nobody can actually see inside the shell to see who the beneficiaries are. Okay, they can all see, okay, well, this property is owned under a trust name, but to the public, who owns the trust? Nobody knows. Okay, so this would effectively shield John's assets against literally any investigation or creditor's claim. So the good thing about it is it gives maximum protection, asset protection for John. Okay, there is minimum exposure. No one actually knows, apart from John himself and his lawyers and the people that set up the trust, no one would know in public who owns this property or what John owns. Okay, there is no public relation between John and the property. And also, another important thing is this structure also gives maximum tax optimization. So what does that mean? So in Australia, like most other countries, this is how tax works, right? So if you're earning, let's say, $20,000 a year, you probably pay no tax or very little tax in Australia. But if you are getting paid $200,000 a year as your income, then you probably have to pay something like 45% in terms of a tax rate. Okay, so tax works in different brackets. The more you make, the more tax you pay. The less you make, the less tax you pay. So in this case, let's say this property is generating $30,000 a year, okay, to this trust. Now, if this trust only has John as the beneficiary, then every time when the trust splits its profit to John, John still has to pay tax, okay, on that $30,000 income. But John is a lot smarter than that. John says, okay, well, I can have literally unlimited number of beneficiaries within the trust. So I'm going to put myself there. I'm going to put my wife there. She works part-time. I'm going to put my 18-year-old son there. I might even want to put my mum there as well. Okay, so my 18-year-old son does not earn income. My mum is retired. She does not earn any income. My wife works part-time and she works, little income. And John himself may be a high-paid salary earner, so he might just want to put himself as one of the beneficiaries, but might not be receiving the income. So, coming back to this example, if this property is earning $30,000 a year, what John can do as the controller or the trustee of the trust is to say, okay, well, with the $30,000 coming in, I'm going to split it into $10,000 to my wife, $10,000 to my son, $10,000 to my mum. Okay, so in that case, if my mum is earning $10,000 from the trust, she doesn't pay tax. If my 18-year-old son earns $10,000 from the trust, he doesn't pay tax. And if my wife earns an extra $10,000, which would probably add to her existing income of, say, $15,000 or $20,000, then she probably pays very little tax, maybe $1,000 or something. Okay, so you see how this works, right? So if John earns the income of $30,000 from this property all by himself, he would probably have to pay maybe, give or take, let's say, $5,000 to $6,000 of tax, right? But if he splits the income from the property through the trust to its beneficiaries, then he can get away with paying literally no tax, okay, by splitting the profit. So that's what we mean by maximum tax optimization. It is not a loophole in the tax system, definitely that's not, but it's something that is used by smart investors all the time for two purposes, that is asset protection and tax optimization. Okay, so the bad thing about this, the downside, is yes, there is annual fees. Generally, it is actually cheaper to set up trust than company, so still there is some annual fees, as well as the establishment fees. And now let's look at a few things to do with actually calculating the return on investment and profit on property investment. So this is typically a formula that we have, and I'm going to show you the Excel spreadsheet in a second. So literally all you need to do is to punch in some numbers like the price of the property, what is the loan value ratio, etc., etc. Okay, so let's just go through this. Property price, this is how much the property price that you're going to be purchasing, the contract price. LVR, the loan value ratio, this is simply saying, look, if you're buying $1 million property and you're borrowing, let's say $700,000 from the bank, okay, that's the amount that you borrow, then the LVR, the loan value ratio in this case, is 70%. Okay, and when you borrow money from the bank, you have to pay the bank interest. So the interest rate, you can fill in there, which is usually between 3 to 6%, give or take. And investment period, this is how long you wish to invest for. These are the expenses. Some of the one-time expenses include the stamp duty. This is a tax that is charged by the government upon the settlement of the property when they change the title from the seller to the buyer. Surcharge is charged generally when the person buying the property in Australia is a foreigner, so it's not an Australian resident. Now, if you are buying under a company or under a trust, if the company has more than 40% shareholder that are foreigners, or if the trust has more than 40% being beneficiaries that are not Australian residents, you still have to pay this surcharge. Now, this surcharge varies from state to state. Okay, so for example, in Victoria, New South Wales, Brisbane, Tasmania, WA, and South Australia, generally it's between 7 to 8%, which is quite heavy. 7 to 8% of the actual purchase price being the extra surcharge charged by the state government if you're a foreigner. Legal fees, as we said, the buyer needs to have a conveyancer or a solicitor. And in this case, this is the fee paid to the conveyancer to act on behalf of the buyer to check contracts, negotiate terms, and communicate with the seller's solicitor. Okay. Bank charges, these, again, there are one-time fees. For example, there would be some establishment fees. Banks would order valuations. Sometimes they'll get the buyer or the applicant, in this case the borrower, to pay for the valuations. The bank themselves might have some legal cost. So generally these would be in the order of, let's say, $1,000 or less, give or take. And then if you are buying a house or apartment or townhouse and you want the rent to be good, it's better to furnish the property. Okay, so to put all the furniture in there. So literally the tenants just need to move in and pay rent, really. So you're saving the tenant's effort, and tenants generally would be willing to pay more. Okay, so these are the one-time costs. Now, besides these costs, there are also annual costs, okay, associated with each property. If the property is used as an investment, you have to pay land tax. Okay, this is a tax calculated based on the value of the land component. Okay, if the property is used for investment. If you are buying a property to live in, okay, generally you don't pay land tax. Okay, so this is only charged when you're making this property for the purpose of, you're buying this property for the purpose of investment. Owner's corporation fees. This is typically when you're buying into an apartment. The apartment is obviously a part of a building, and the building has a building manager or building management company, which would do things like the general maintenance, the repairs of lifts, the maintenance of, for example, the gym, the pool, and making sure that there is security guards in the building. So these are the different things that the owners corporation or the building managers would do, and each apartment owner will need to pay a fee to contribute towards that building management fee. Okay, council rates. You might recall earlier in our last module, council is the finer granularity below the state level. So a state can have many different councils. A council can have many different suburbs. A council will generally do things like maintaining the parks, making sure that the sewage pipes all work fine, making sure that the rubbish bins are collected, and making sure that the environment and everything is good, and it's also very secure. So all these things is what the councils do, and every resident, every owner of the property needs to pay a council rate. Okay, so this is like the council fee. Sewage and water, so this is again something charged by either the council or a state-owned government company, and they would maintain things like the sewage pipes and making sure that the water is clean, and make the necessary repairs. So every house, every property owner will need to pay a sewage or water rate. Generally, with every property, we highly recommend that we have insurance in place, just in case if there is, things like fire, theft, and other things. Okay, just to make sure that you're protected. Okay, and obviously, when you borrow money from the bank, you have to pay interest to the bank on a monthly basis. But this is we just make it into the annual cost. Okay, so this is something that is ongoing, right? Whereas these ones are one-time cost. Okay, then from this we can then work out what the total expenses are, and work out what the total investment is. Okay, and then that's the one in red is what you have to spend, and the one in green is what you are earning. So as a start, you can have your rental income paid by the tenant, okay, into either your nominated bank account, or the tenants can pay it into our property management account, and after we deduct our fees, we then pay that into your nominated account. So that's the actual cash flow. The growth per annum, this is something that is quite invisible, so to speak, because unless you sell your property, you really don't know what profit you can make on the property in terms of capital growth. But when you are making comparisons to recent sales or properties that have been sold near you, then you can sort of work out what your property is valued at, and that take away the property price that you bought at would give you the price that it has grown. Okay, so this is the growth per annum. Okay, this is the capital growth, or we call it appreciation. Okay, then from these you can work out what the total income is, and if you sell your property after this investment period, then you can make a profit margin, and here you can have your sales profit margin. And then from these stats, we can then do some subtraction, some multiply, and work out the return on investment, annual return on investment, and the overall return on investment. Okay, so we can select an apartment and go through those numbers, so you can see this in a real example.